Jordan, so good to reconnect with you. It's been a minute.
Yeah.
It's been a little while since we did the last one. We had to take some time off for a little bit. It's just crazy. There's not really anything going on in the news. It's hard to know what to focus on.
Pretty slow. Couple weeks.
Really slow weeks. I know. So yeah. I don't know what you're thinking, but
yeah, the State of the Union, and I think that's it.
Yeah, it's just to talk about like sports and gaming. I think for this one,
sounds
probably
good.
Be the best. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Welcome back to the show, everyone. You might be surprised to know this, being a little bit facetious in some of this, in what we were just saying. It's been a crazy couple of weeks since we were last with you. We're talking today with Spencer Ackerman, author of the book Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump, about this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. It's been really crazy. The discourse has been absolutely mind-melting over the last few weeks, but we had a really interesting conversation with Spencer to get into this. We did have to take some time off, as I mentioned, because I was getting my marching orders from the FSB and I was getting all my Putin propaganda talking points in order. Now that that's done, I'm really ready to get into this. So I think it's going to be a good episode.
Definitely. I think it's good that we took some time before we talked about this. There's no need to rush into a conversation like this. We don't need to do an emergency pod. Like, no one's looking to us for the first analysis of a awful and ever emerging situation. So that time off, I think, was good and healthy.
Yeah, although I did rush right into my analysis of
did
it
you?
elsewhere.
Oh my god.
But that's just how that's what I have to do now. I'm a slave to the
content machine.
The content mines, exactly.
Yeah.
But how are you holding up though? Because it's been mentally draining, honestly, just the last couple of weeks as this kind of kicked off, and just like I mentioned, the discourse has been wild about it. You've got the media has just been really going back to a place in terms of the relentless kind of war cheerleading that's going on right now that I feel like it hasn't really been for quite a long time. You see a lot of people getting sucked into that. It's been very, very kind of like alienating and difficult to deal with. How are you coping with all that?
Well, I mean, I try to recognize that it's very easy to be in the West and observe this from afar. And I'm not saying you don't, but that's just kind of what I've been trying to center, because this is horrific. It's awful to watch. It's frustrating. It's saddening. It's emotional. And I think what's really tough for a lot of people is that everyone just kind of feels powerless in all this. People want to do something. Many people want this to end and peacefully, swiftly, but there's no real way to do that, and people are kind of struggling with how you make sense of that. And I feel like there's just a lot of really wacky conversations and wacky emotions and actions that just like aren't helpful ultimately. And what's most troubling right now is this growing and seems to be rapidly growing, I don't know if I want to call it a consensus just yet, but push for a no-fly zone in Ukraine without there being like any recognition of what that would look like and what that would almost certainly trigger.
Yeah, I mean, people tend to think that a no-fly zone is basically just this magic spell that gets cast that somehow stops planes from flying this region. And I don't think people that are advocating for that definitely right now have fully reckoned with what that actually is in reality, not the sort of fantasy version of it.
Right, and there's some of the artillery and weaponry that Russia is using wouldn't even be subject to that. They have these Smerch, the MLRS systems, like the Smerches. It's basically like these trucks that launch. They have like huge tubes. You would probably know it to see it, and they shoot rockets containing warheads, and within them are clusters of like 70 plus submunitions that each release 96 individual fragments of metal, And to quote Jack Crosby, friend of the show and friend of ours, who is reporting on the ground in Ukraine, quote, any one of which can immediately end a human life. And he continues, the bomblets themselves often do not detonate, meaning there are often dozens or hundreds of small deadly bombs spread across an area after an attack has ended. What often happens next is that curious children pick up the bomblets and die. It's worth noting that cluster munitions are banned by an international treaty that both the United States and Russia refuse to sign. So when they're using things like that, that's not subject to a no-fly zone. They're still going to be able to wreak havoc on people, and all this no-fly zone would do would just escalate tensions, be seen as an act of aggression from outside states, or interpreted as an act of war by them, by Putin, because that's, basically what he said, and likely trigger a full-out war, including like other NATO countries and Western allies. If you want to call it World War III, it could be deemed as such. That is horrifying.
Yeah, that's not going to actually have the result of protecting people in Ukraine. Average people in Ukraine are going to be the first people to be harmed in case of this kind of escalation. Right. And that's the kind of dangerous thing about this moment, is that there's a lot of calls for these kinds of escalations in the name of protecting Ukraine, which doesn't quite square up to the actual reality of what this would look like if it actually plays out in this way. This is something we talked to Spencer Ackerman about, and I think we should probably just get to this interview with Spencer. We cover a wide range of what is going on with this conflict, the context of it. It's a really great discussion. I think you folks are going to really enjoy it. And it's an extra long one as well. We've been away for a couple days, so it's an extra long, supersized episode. Really good talk. So let's cut the intro, cut the chit chat. Let's get right down to business and bring on Spencer Ackerman. He's going to be joining the show right after this. No, yeah, I think if Spencer, if you're worried about getting put on Putin bot Twitter lists, I'm certainly on a number of these lists. Absolutely, yeah. Big Putin defender over here, actually.
Yours fits though. I think that's what's different.
That's the main difference. It is deserved. So
I see.
It's tough but fair. Tough but fair. How about you, Jordan? Are you getting put in any crazy lists right now?
Yeah, I got a few. I think like the same type of shit, like dumbass lefty type stuff, and it's just like, and it would only come if I like posted anything about like Azov Battalion, which was like maybe once or twice, because it's like, yeah, that's awful that they're like, a part of the Ukrainian military, but it's not like the main issue here. It's like this is an issue of like Ukraine's autonomy and invasion and now killing civilians, but like if it came up at like any point, it'd be like, oh, this guy just wants to, side with Russia, or like any commentary on the US's relationship with NATO and how it has engaged in foreign policy or engaged around the world, diplomatically or otherwise, for the last couple of decades, which like definitely is a factor in some conversations. People like, you think this is the time for this now? And like it'd be the same types of responses and
yeah, it's actually a pretty good time now to talk about some of that stuff. Really.
I would say,
yeah. One and like an important framework too, when you point this out, is that like, trying to explain something is not justifying it. I mean, there is a difference. You can talk about historical context. You can and should talk about.
Oh my God!
What is? Oh my goodness! I know this is crazy. This is the crazy Putin defending kind of rhetoric that I'm often espousing. But you can talk about that context, and you can talk about the role that the West has played in like pushing things to this point without justifying this like dangerous kind of escalation that's, like you said, harming people are being killed, cities are being bombed. That's not a justification, but we should still probably be able to talk openly and honestly about like what has been going on and what role we played in pushing things to here.
It didn't happen overnight, and it's not like a silo. No. Like it's a lot of things at play.
So I got put on like some, I don't know what they call it, like OSINT watch or something, with like a bunch of people who like I do not like and who do not like me, for as best I can tell, writing two pieces, one of which was taking note of how the United States, after 15 years, the same week that Putin invaded Ukraine, was continuing to bomb Somalia. It so happened that
so that was one of those open source intelligence things.
Well, it's basically just a friend of mine sent me this infographic that someone made, compiling from OSINT Watch or whatever it is. I don't know if you've seen this thing. I don't know, but it was basically
I think I might have seen it actually. Yeah.
Well, the other thing was
that's
something
actually why we invited you on the show, for that exact reason.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Yes. Good to have this context, you guys.
Yeah.
And then the other thing was I wrote a piece for my newsletter, Forever Wars, plug, that was taking note of some research by an economist who I respect, noting the similarities between the sanctions on Iran and the sanctions on Russia, and drawing some kind of preliminary points about how, one thing that sanctions on Iran did not do was, bring down the Iranian government, but it sure did immiserate a decade of regular working and middle class Iranian people. And when, in one day, the ruble loses 30 and then bounces up to 25% of its value, I think it's fair to say that oligarchs are pretty well insulated from the shocks of that, and regular Russians who had nothing to do with Putin's invasion are not. And I think it is very necessary, when remembering the history of how Putin was able to rise to power by both being proximate to and benefiting from the deep anxiety and dissatisfaction among everyday Russians about the shattering collapse of their economy in the 1990s, entirely abetted by Western capital. Putin, interestingly enough, after he left the KGB and the Soviet Union fell and so forth, he was one of the first people working for the mayor in St. Petersburg, literally welcoming foreign capital, foreign banks into St. Petersburg to essentially, quote unquote, invest in the new Russia, and in fact, benefit from the ruthless privatization of state assets. So Putin is certainly, in both an indirect political sense, and, to some degree, although we've never really been able to, I was reading Stephen Lee Meyer's book, The New Tsar, The Rise and Reign of Vladimir Putin, which is a New York Times bureau chief's very journalistic, really engaging history of Putin from, being seen up close. And it makes the point that no one ever actually tied Putin directly to, straight up corruption during the 90s. But there's a lot of things that smell funny that people haven't been able to fully connect. But the overall point being, the mass immiseration of Russia, from both an economic and from a geopolitical sense, exploited in both senses by the West, is how we got Putin.
Yes.
Maybe it's reasonable to ask if the circumstances right now, intended however, to get Putin out of Ukraine are recapitulating those same circumstances. I have no idea. I want to say up front, I'm not a Russia guy. I'm not a Ukraine guy. I read a bunch. I've done extremely little journalism on this stuff. It is not my specialty. So I am trying to be, OSINT Watch notwithstanding, pretty meager in, what I'm putting out here. I am trying actively not to discourse about this. But I think it's pretty messed up that, after having experienced catastrophe after catastrophe, foreseeable catastrophe after foreseeable catastrophe, engineered by the bipartisan U.S. foreign policy consensus, whether they can perhaps be made to see how some of the disasters that we are seeing right now, obviously Vladimir Putin has made his decisions, but the bed was kind of set in a lot of important ways by Western and capital hubris, willful blindness, obsessive ideology, a Cold War mentality that never ceased to exist, and perhaps these things that are now like explicitly part of the U.S. response here. Like there's, talk about, and this of course is Putin's miscalculation that now Finland is like seeking NATO accession. Like Putin did that, right? But how else after this 30-year history could Russians beyond Putin, perhaps whoever comes after Putin, not interpret what we're seeing now in terms of the U.S. response through that prism? And that is not a path to de-escalation, and de-escalation is what we desperately need in this circumstance. That's all I got.
Well, okay, I mean, that's a we really dove right into it head first. Let's take a small step back here and say hello to Spencer Ackerman.
Hi.
National security reporter. He's the author of the book Reign of Terror, How the 9/11 Era Destabilized America and Produced Trump. He's also the creator of the Forever Wars Substack and one of our partners in the Discontents Substack group that we've got going. Spencer, thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Thanks very much, Rob. Thanks very much to Jordan as well. Thank you guys for having me. Discontents all day.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Jordan, do we want to?
Yeah,
do we want to take
to.
Okay, all right.
We have to. So, Spencer, we ask everybody the same question, just so we know who we're dealing with and whether or not the interview should continue. And we know you're a comic book guy, but there's a more important attribute, I think, for people across the board, not just in the media. But so, Spencer, are you a gamer?
No, I'm not. I'm not a gamer. I don't. Can I tell you why?
The Putin apologism I could have put up with. This is a bridge too far, though.
I have. Jordan, I think I might have told you this. I don't know. I think what even gamers such as yourselves, I presume, will like consider a pretty good reason for why I'm not a gamer, and it goes like this. In I guess like the late 80s, when I was like 7 or 8, my mother got me a Nintendo, like kids were starting to get. And, it was the one with like Duck Hunt and Super Mario. And I thought that was fun. Like the other kids, I was like learning how to play these things and like figuring out like how the controllers worked and so forth. But the thing is my dad fucking loved it. And like the king he is, he stopped going to work so he could stay up all night and then through the day playing Nintendo. And this, as you can imagine, like alarmed my mother sufficiently. So after a couple weeks, she threw out the Nintendo. And very rapidly, I saw, like when I would like go to friends' house, that like if you weren't like actively practicing like your video game skills, like you were just going to get like embarrassed, smoked.
Sure.
Like after like sufficient time that I was just like, I'm not going to do this. Like that deterred me. And like, I have one life to live. This is not going to be how I spend it. Your mileage may vary. You decide if the interview continues or not.
We'll think about it.
Well, yeah, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Spencer. Thank you. No.
Well, honestly, I'm appreciative of an honest answer, and rather than people who try to like they know what we want the answer to be, and I'd rather it be a blunt no than someone try to blow smoke up our ass. Be like, well, I played Mario Kart as a kid. It's like, that doesn't count.
No, count.
This is how foreign the language you're speaking is to me. Is that a thing? like fake gamer cred? Like is that that's a thing people
steal
do?
Valor.
Oh my god.
Yeah, you get the employee, you get the veteran, like gamer veteran discount at all the restaurants.
You want to get grandfathered in.
Just the real first responders.
Yeah. I thought a good place to start. Not that we kind of already started. This is like a Quentin Tarantino movie, this interview. We started one place in the middle and then we moved back. Well, one thing I wanted to know, Spencer, just to talk about the early stages of this invasion, I was just wondering were you surprised when this started to kick off? And I just asked that because I was one of these people who was kind of loudly and publicly saying, like, no, of course, Russia's not going to invade Ukraine. There may be some kind of a situation where they put troops into these eastern republics to sort of try to stop the fighting there. Maybe that's going to be the extent of it. And my feeling was just like, I just intrinsically mistrust what I hear from the sort of U.S. national security establishment and the media. And when I see them kind of getting into this hysterical mode of there's this imminent invasion, my first reaction to that is no, there is not. And like, what is actually going on here? So I was quite taken aback when it's like, oh, okay, Russia really did invade Ukraine. This is not some limited action in eastern Ukraine. They're invading the whole country. There's that speech of Putin where he's talking about engaging, beginning this denazification process and demilitarization. I was really taken aback. So I was wondering where you were at when this kicked off and whether you were as surprised as I was when this really started to come together.
So I have not spent very much of my my career reporting on Russia. Very, sporadically, stuff I would do for Wired that would be like either like around the first wave of like the 2010 Anna what's her name spy outings when that happened, and then like the election interference stuff. When I was at the Daily Beast, but like primarily like I had been like trying to write about Russia genuinely as little as I could, because like I just felt you really need a tremendous amount of background that I probably was not going to develop fast enough to like cover this stuff responsibly. Like I'm a war on terror reporter, and so like when Russia stuff intersected with that, I would write about that, but like, not really like Russia qua Russia
and stuff like that.
Yeah. And like, I knew people, including, weirdly, like one of the first people, I ever worked for in journalism, a guy named Andrei Slivka, when I was at a now deceased Alt Weekly, when I was a teenager and then in college, when I was in college, called New York Press. Andre went, he's Ukrainian American. He went to cover the Orange Revolution. I remember reading his coverage there, but like, sporadically stuff, obviously, when the invasion and occupation of Crimea happened, paid some attention to that. But like, I'm not that guy. I would strongly suggest everyone read reporters on the ground, our friend Jack Crosby, a friend of mine from The Guardian, Sean Walker, another friend of mine from The Guardian, Emma Graham Harrison, reporters who are really doing very brave work in Ukraine, covering the occupation from the perspective of the people who have to endure it. I say that all to say, when over the January and February's development of the Russian buildup for what they were describing as an exercise, like we've heard a lot of the exercise stuff before, and like that's part of the point of these sorts of exercise. Like you may or may not remember, but like right after 9/11, Russia under Putin like stopped a very large military exercise that was predicated on fighting like a United States like enemy. So like these things kind of happen. Like they, there's ambiguity kind of baked in to the process, and like you really have to be, far more of like an intelligence professional, and then to really be able to say like definitively, one way or another that it was going to happen. So like, on the other hand, this is a weird one because it is Putin fighting a very American kind of war, which is to say like, what the fuck were you thinking? Like kind of war. And like with the important exception of Grozny in 1999-2000, Putin has intended to do that. The reason why it has seemed like he has enjoyed like a decade, or a decade plus, I guess 15 years, starting with Estonia in 2008 of military success is because he tends to pick very limited objectives, things he knows he can succeed at. He knew he could bite off Crimea. He knew he could stir up enough of a separatist movement or exploit an extant separatist movement. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I'm not trolling. I'm telling you genuinely, I do not know. Don't come at me. in eastern Ukraine, in the Russian, speaking parts of eastern Ukraine. And he knew that all he had to do in Syria was to mercilessly, pitilessly destroy and suppress anything that looked like resistance to Assad's rule on the Mediterranean coast and in northwestern Syria. So I guess I was kind of not sure one way or the other, and could see like this could entirely be like, bullshit, like Western provocation based on like a hysterical reading of intelligence for reasons either sincere or cynical, or I don't know, it could also be like Putin really showing himself to be as like ruthless as we saw in both Crimea, in Chechnya, and in Syria. And so like I didn't really know which way any of this was going to go. I was, watching like everyone else. I was trying to listen more than speak. And then when Putin gives like the fucking Dr. Doom speech, like at that point I was like, oh no, I guess he really is gonna really do this.
Really going for it. Yeah.
He's real like we're not talking about like, and the scenes where like his advisors like aren't quite sure they're on the same script with him, and he's like moving them kind of rhetorically in the direction of like saying like, so you think it's a good idea to end this Nazi threat, emerging out of Ukraine too, and like they're like, yes, I do think that. So at that point, it seemed like this was now a foregone conclusion. The question was going to be like, how horrific is this going to get? Like this is a force that like has proven that like it can flatten a city like Grozny. It can flatten a city like Aleppo. Like it can do this to Kiev. It can do this to Kharkiv. It can, like, I don't know if they will, but like we have to like really constantly remember that like things can get extremely bad in Ukraine, and that I think compels us like to seek any de-escalatory solution as quickly as possible. And I'm not sure how many of those like I can really identify on offer. One of the people I've turned to help understand like sanctions from a critical perspective is an economist named Isfandyar Batman-Khelidj, and he wrote a paper that I mentioned earlier analyzing the way these sanctions worked. And it was pretty clear that if his analysis is correct, like this is detonating, this is basically weaponizing inflation. And if you're an oligarch, that will hurt you, but it won't hurt you anywhere near as much as like someone who isn't able to like move their assets like from country to country as needed. And like it is amazing, like I don't want to say amazing, that's a bad word. It is astonishing to watch as a matter of statecraft like how rapidly the Western capitalist powers are like lining up to like shut down an economy, given the degree to which like the elites that like the political system at the very least is like most maximally responsive to in each of these countries, our own most certainly included, if not foremost among them, like is also how those elites operate. Like one thing that I think has been pretty positive in terms of like capital D discourse about this is there is, at least I have seen much more of an understanding that like the United States is also an oligarchy. I don't know like what you guys think. This is not a
distinctly Russian phenomenon.
Like, I don't know if you guys, if maybe you guys who have been like more online than I have over the last, week or so, you tell me if you think that impression is exaggerated or like a function of like the crowd that I follow. But, I have been surprised the degree to which like making that point has been somewhat frictionless, in the way that like, as I found out, like if you talk about like the sanctions being very potentially bad, or have you noticed the United States is like continuing to do its own forever wars 15 years later in countries like Somalia, like that turns out not to be friction. That turns out to be rather contested points.
I think, there definitely was surprised with how often things like that got mentioned. Like, but I did see some pushback that with so many other aspects of this, now is not the time to be talking about that. This isn't when you should be bringing that up. I did see a lot of that kind of tut-tutting, like, oh, the lefties really want to keep driving this point that America bad. And it's just like, well, no, you mean if this is a problem and we have that here, but what are you doing about it? And these people who are trying to shut down that discussion aren't willing to do anything about it, even when this isn't happening.
If there is one through line that I found with the war on terror, like something that just became like a pattern that repeated so often that it became like very grimly predictable, is that once people are convinced that like they have no choice, that like only one option is like morally acceptable and possible, then it is extremely difficult for, when that policy fails, for failure not to become an argument for escalation instead of reconsideration. Every time the wars went worse, the argument was throw more into it. Every single time. Every single time. That is something that I'm very worried about with something like this, because like you can always eat, like, particularly because it seems like, you know, there was a moment while the moment before the invasion when we were talking about how the Biden administration was deliberately starving Afghanistan, like crippling the economy of a country out of spite for having the temerity to win a 20-year war against the United States. There was starting to be some discussion about how these kinds of sanctions, like the United States has put on Iran and is now putting on Russia, are not, in fact, like alternatives to war. They're on a continuum with war. That like this is capitalist siegecraft, and if you are on the receiving end of this, if like you are not like if as precarity envelops more and more of your life, you know, are you more or are you less inclined to be susceptible to demagogic messages? Right? Like, I think the United States has really demonstrated this. And we were starting, I feel, to get somewhere in that discussion, because, like, the abject moral horror of starving Afghanistan, decimating its central banking, structurally doing so, was so enormous to contemplate. And then Putin invades Ukraine. And because, you know, it seems like there's no choice that won't involve more war. I think that's the generous understanding of why people are so in on these sanctions. There has been like a lot less patience with people like myself who have made that point, and who, like, even when, you know, we make the argument that, like, you know, I think the problem with the sanctions is that they risk like starving and immiserating like millions of people who didn't choose the invasion and can't control it and can't stop it, and is basically like a taunt to a man who, I reiterate, flattened Grozny and Aleppo to care about the well-being of his people. If the point is that Putin, as an autocrat who rules through a personality cult, which I've seen like repeated enough, and like I don't particularly think it's wrong, but if that's the point about like the thing about Putin that I see, you know, very often made in the press, then like that ought to like give you more pause, right, about the sanctions' magical ability to compel Putin to change his behavior, because the people of Russia, who, as we like, what are they supposed to do? Like, the people of Russia are like have been so overwhelmingly suppressed in their ability to protest domestically by the Putin regime that I truly don't understand like what the end game of the sanctions is. Is that like someone in the Kremlin kills Putin and like orders a retreat? You know, one of the things,
you've got U.S. senators like Lindsey Graham openly speculating on this,
openly speculating about
it, which seems a little irresponsible, I think, from an elected official. But you know, like, I guess that's why I'm sitting here and he's over there.
I mean, like, the thing about American exceptionalism is that you don't really ever imagine that the person on the other side of the assassination is going to be you. And like, I would suggest that, like, you know, the 21st century isn't really going to go America's way, guys. You know, I normally hesitate from predictions, but like, I just think, like, you know, multipolarity is going to proliferate. And, you know, even when the United States is not going to be done, like, on the global stage. The Ottoman Empire, like, you could really argue, like, the Ottoman Empire was under decline, like, anywhere from 100 to 300 years before its actual collapse.
Well, that, I mean, like what you're saying, I mean, even this invasion in and of itself is kind of evidence that we have kind of stepped into this new multipolar world, because this is not something that would happen if there was still the situation where America was the undisputed, unequivocal global world police, that everyone kind of accepted the situation. It's clear that there is a kind of new geopolitical reality that's kind of emerging here, and I think this invasion of Ukraine is kind of the first sign of that. This kind of real sign that is kind of the new paradigm that we're stepping into right now.
I don't know if it's the first, especially because, like, you know, Syria was right there. You know, you had Syria as, like, a very, like, almost impenetrably, like, complexly multipolar, foreign-sponsored civil war, revolution, uprising, like, jihadist takeover. Like it was, you know, drawing in, like, multiple superpower challenges that now had to, like, wonder, like, what does the stasis that this produces itself ultimately produce? And, like, we don't have an answer, except that, like, it can sure as hell preserve Bashar Assad's hold on power. And I guess the point that I'm stumbling at making is that if this is going to be, like, likely how the world takes shape, that ought to give, like, more reason for pause about the consequences of, like, immiserating Russians, like, especially if, as can only happen if Putin's strategy somehow succeeds, like, to deepen the war. Like, it seems, you know, again, I don't know this stuff. Like, Russia and Ukraine are not my things. Don't come for me. A whole lot of this is extemporizing right now. But, like, if Putin succeeds, the Ukrainians are not going to, like, lay down their arms and not resist. I think that is exceptionally clear from the last week. So the Russians, like, can occupy Ukraine, but, like, not peacefully, like, not under, you know, conditions without resistance. The longer that goes on, the longer the sanctions persist, and then inevitably, I think, the escalatory pressures on the United States and NATO to back a Ukrainian insurgency are going to be overwhelming. This is going to take a tremendous amount of political mobilization to resist, because, like, left on its own, the entire political establishment, which is, like, celebrating, like, a moment seemingly of like, if not unity, consensus, is only going to ask, as an occupation of Ukraine persists, surely they know the generals, the paramilitary structures. It sure looks like the CIA would know, like, the most nefarious actors in Ukraine that are surely going to get, like, the most, like, unfortunate exposure in the case of a nationalist revolution against an occupier. And, like, that's going to be so potentially catastrophic that it will be an enormous test of where, like, a socialist, internationalist-minded left, will that left contend against that point? How successful will it be? What, in a post-Bernie Sanders world, will that look like? Would that look like? I don't have any answers to any of these questions. I think, like, these are going to be, like, questions to watch as, like, facts, you know, compel them in their development. But it just seems like, as best as I can see, as, again, a non-expert, don't come for me, that, like, if Putin succeeds, that's going to be, like, catastrophic for him in a way, like really so grimly reminiscent of the United States toppling Saddam Hussein. The worst thing that could happen is the United States got what it wanted, and that's exactly what happened.
I'd like to get your thoughts on the sanctions and how they work, because I think you were kind of you had made some comments about how you were surprised, not necessarily surprised, but kind of like, frustrated, and your reaction to taking on core components of Russia's economy in the immediate aftermath of doing the same in Afghanistan, and just leaving people there to languish. And we're seeing downstream effects already. And like you pointed out, this is going to affect the average Russian who had nothing to do with the invasion. And, by even what we could tell, a ton of people in Russia are opposed to this. Over 13,000 protesters have already been arrested for protesting against the invasion. Over 4,000 just this past Sunday. So people are still taking to the streets to protest, knowing what they are, what they're risking, or a brutal assault or arrest. And some of these sanctions have downstream effects. So like you pointed out, the ruble just crumbled, and it's just worth like less than a penny to the dollar, and that makes things harder to buy. People need funds, and all these other companies have piled on. And this is what I've really been fascinated by and maddened by, because some of these companies have nothing to do. They had nothing they needed to do. They weren't touched by these sanctions. Some of these companies are doing it for positive PR. Like Nike and Adidas and Spotify are all saying, we're going to shut down operations in Russia. IKEA is going to close its stores. And all of these companies, Disney isn't going to release new movies in Russia. And it's like, who the fuck cares? And it's just like all of these things collectively make the living conditions for people in Russia worse under this. I think that the intent for all of this collectively is to make people there so angry at Putin that they'll turn on him and oust him. But studies on sanctions show this doesn't really work, especially with an autocrat. He doesn't care. Why would he care?
This never happens. Why would he care? He flattened Grozny. This is supposed to be, the people who make this argument, they're supposed to be the ones who can recite to you the way that he flattened Grozny, he flattened Aleppo, he took Crimea. He, in almost a Napoleonic way, ousted old elites and replaced them with his own. And that's, again, a story that ought to militate against the theory that is repeated so often. I wonder if it's even believed, because it never bears out that the sanctions will ultimately produce a catastrophic effect on either the targeted regime or its policies. And that just doesn't happen. The times that it just vanishingly few compared to how much sanctions are pursued by the United States, as increasingly done in a manner that, and this is where the analysis of the current sanctions comes, reminiscent of what the United States did and continues to do to Iran, the so-called crippling sanctions ahead of the nuclear deal. The point being, I am not an economist. And I'm certainly not a sanctions economic technician. So I have been relying on the work of an economist named Isfandyar Batman-Khalij. I apologize, Yar, if I mispronounced your name. And on March 1st on my newsletter Forever Wars, you can read a piece called Making Ordinary Russians Suffer for Putin's Invasion. And his analysis of the sanctions is that, I'll just read, these are 2 paragraphs that he writes on what he expects, their immediate economic material result, and then its political impact. So, there is significant potential for domestic wealth to pour into the stock exchange, whether spurred by the inflationary environment or encouraged as a matter of new government policy. The implication is that capital markets are useful tools for preserving capital. The desperation of middle and working classes in Russia may help shore up the wealth of oligarchs already in stocks and real estate. Many of the enterprises that oligarchs control may successfully adjust to the new reality and remain profitable. A new class of light oligarchs may emerge as certain light manufacturing enterprises benefit from reduced competition and better export prospects. The financial war could also provide a pretext for state capture, with private capital facilitating rentierism, corruption, or smuggling deemed expedient in the face of sanctions. Take all this together, and it becomes clear that the most problematic aspects of Russian political economy, the obscene concentration of wealth among a politically connected ruling class, will remain unchanged in the financial war. Meanwhile, the immiseration of the middle and working classes will further disempower civil society, creating a dynamic where dangerous protests are the only means through which to air grievances, and in which deprivation focuses those protests on wages and bread. Is that a place we want to be? I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially when you point out the direct link between the West destroying and plundering the Russian economy in the 90s, leading directly to Putin in the first place, you see this cycle repeating itself again. And yeah, I don't see like there's such potential for that to go just as badly as it did before, which is a hard thing to, I think, really get on board with. To say nothing of the fact that, like, it's not like, you know, any country should be able to just participate in such a violent invasion with zero consequence, but at a certain point, there's still this question of, like, how America still has this ability to play world police in this moment and to kind of morally grandstand in the way that they are right now and to enact these kinds of consequences while they themselves have committed horrific crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, while our allies in Saudi Arabia and Israel are committing these horrific crimes as well. There's a moral question there as well, whereas at what point does America lose this ability to engage in this kind of like economic punishment for Russia committing these crimes while we ourselves, or you know, we in the West are guilty of our own set of horrific crimes for which there's never been any accountability or no punishment whatsoever?
I would just also add that like a dynamic that will be very soon important, I think, to consider is that Russia has its hawks too. And their experience has been, I mean, like, look, also, I'm not a Kremlinologist, so maybe I'm going to pump my own brakes a little. But the point I'm going to make is that we have seen through the war on terror examples of how we often do not take into consideration the degrees to which our adversaries are tremendously adaptive and respond to provocations that sometimes the United States does not appreciate that it is making. And just from reading Stephen Lee Meyer's book, I'm something like a third of the way through it, it seems that there are enough of those people like inside the Russian state apparatus, Putin speaking for them as someone who, like, you know, watched an empire collapse and then was determined, like, ever since to find a way to avenge that. And like now has reached a point where, like, I was, you know, listening to Tony Wood tell Dan Denver on The Dig, you know, someone who really is, you know, a Russia expert, like say that like this was the first time he could like recall Putin doing something that he considered truly irrational. That like Putin had made like previously there had been discernible, and this is my understanding of his point, you know, you understand why Putin flattened Chechnya. Explicitly, he was trying to avenge the humiliation of losing the first Chechnya war, as well to stop, as he, like, as Stephen Lee Meyer's book has him saying, like, really consistently, what he considers, for, I think, real material reason, as well as historical reason, historical context, certainly. I'm not saying I endorse this view of history. I'm trying to explicate it. The fracturing of a Russian empire that, to a certain mode of thinking, is Russia itself. And, like, that needs to contend in peaceful ways with Ukrainian nationalism, but no one's trying to hear that right now, particularly in its relationship with them, with Ukrainian nationalism. And in his, like, moves to, you know, as you know, seems to be the, you know, a through line here, not just avenge, but also reverse the loss of a kind of Greater Russia, like a real revanchist move in a kind of like classical realist sense, then like even on those terms, the invasion of Ukraine is just fucking crazy and seems like him losing touch. I am, learning about these cultural and historical dynamics like everyone else. So I make no claim to expertise. Do not come for me. We're on a podcast and we are vibing. But
that's when you say that legally people can't come for you when you say that disclaimer.
Legally speaking, that's it. Yeah. You have no power anymore. Your jurisdiction is done. I don't know how what story Putin has told himself about how maybe he believes this shit that the Zelensky government is a Nazi government NATO stalking horse. The NATO stalking horse at this point is fucking if it wasn't before, buddy, it sure fucking is now, right?
Yeah.
Zelensky.
I mean, in a way, he's given NATO the
right
people
there.
that are part of that. It's given them everything they wanted. Yeah.
We're talking literally about the possible NATO accession of Finland. This, bellwether shit. Right up against, real, core Russia going back to Peter the Great in this mode of thinking. So great job, Vlad. But this is a dangerous thing. I think the lesson that we really ought to, take is a lesson from Syria, that there are so many levels of bad this can get to. And one of those levels is also the potential extinction of mankind.
That's a pretty bad one.
Yeah, I don't want to be an alarmist about this, but this is exactly the shit you wanted never to happen. A real NATO Russia confrontation at a moment where Putin really seems like he's just fucking going for it, from a historical perspective.
Although I know you said you were kind of tuned out of the online discourse, but there's a lot of people online that are reminding us now. Yeah, nuclear winter would it be really that bad? Yeah, it would be.
Are they seriously?
It would be quote unquote bad, but
bad.
It wouldn't be.
There's a but. There are people who are putting oh my god.
Yeah,
That's
where the discourse is at.
The discourse is at whatabouting nuclear winter.
Yeah. It's not as bad as people make it out. You're being alarmist.
Yeah, being a bit of alarmist with the whole nuclear annihilation thing.
I just really have to say, one of the lessons that I take from COVID-19, I guess, is now, particularly now that, this entire generation, multiple generations of Americans, basically the experience over the last 30 years, is that American exceptionalism on unimaginable, on previously unfathomable scales makes American lack of consequence seem just as natural as the weather. And supposedly 9/11 shattered that, but really in fact it validated it, as the war on terror in its ongoing sense has proven. And COVID-19 has just sort of showed a whole lot of people who are willing to espouse shit like herd immunity because they imagine they're the immunity and only other people are the herd.
Yeah.
And I submit to you that one real dangerous consequence of American empire and the very central to being American doctrine of American exceptionalism is that we do not adequately appreciate, first, how bad shit can get. This really can run a literally apocalyptic, not a hyperbolic one, a literally apocalyptic possibility. And once that exists, you have to wonder about who is going to be able to prompt a de-escalation from that. How much residual communication can exist and remain existing amongst, military staffs. Maybe it's important to back up in one thing, because this may not be obvious for listeners, but one of the reasons the world still exists is because during the Cold War, the American and Soviet national security apparatuses, particularly the militaries, realized that they had to constantly be in communication so as not to surprise the other side into thinking that there was a potential, nuclear possible threat to themselves underway. So lines of communication for decades, even during periods of deep political turmoil, have held. And this is going to be a moment in which that structure is going to come under very serious challenge. And the substance of those communications, which we may not know, it's going to take, put it this way, it will take reporting to find out. Like, that's going to be a very important thing to watch. You know, he says, you know, because, like, the alternative is that, like, we're recording this right now at 10 o'clock at night, and I'd really like it to, like, not very suddenly get bright.
Yeah. You mentioned a while back, too, how, you know, you mentioned, you know, Russia does have hawks, and this is, there has been this element, regardless of how beyond any reasonable explanation of sort of self-defense, or I mean, you talked about the sort of like the American aspects of this invasion, and I think that's kind of another part of it, is this kind of giving these very humanitarian reasons. Like, it seems like it is very inspired by like American war on terror rhetoric, as Putin talks about these humanitarian purposes, defending people in East Ukraine and this denazification process, etc. But I mean, if the reality is, even if you think this is over the line and not, you know, way beyond any reasonable claim of self-defense, as I do, just to clear this up in case anyone's confused with my viewpoint on this. But there's really very real phenomenon that we do need to, like, I think probably talk about here. I mean, I've been talking about this stuff for a while. I wouldn't call myself an expert in Russia and Ukraine or anything like that, but I've been talking about this stuff for a while because, you know, I'm Canadian, and I've been wondering why, for the last few years, our government has been arming and funding and training these militias in Ukraine, including like Azov Battalion and these neo-Nazi militias. Our prime minister in waiting, our deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, is this kind of like part of this ultra-nationalist Ukrainian diaspora. Her grandfather was a Ukrainian nationalist fascist collaborator in World War II, Michael Chomiak, and has had this like...
That seems bad. I'm just going to say that seems bad.
No, it is very bad. So that's been my general viewpoint on this, is that, like, I don't think that it is good that the Canadian government, as well as the United States government, have been like arming and funding these groups in eastern Ukraine. And like, after a certain point, we have to ask ourselves these critical questions about what our government has been trying to achieve by doing this. I mean, I know that what the rhetoric is, how they're just, you know, they're protecting Ukraine from this Russian aggression. But this kind of does go both ways. And even though I think Putin is very cynically weaponizing a lot of this stuff, he's cynically weaponizing this very real fascist element in Ukraine, even though this idea that Ukraine is some country that's just infested with neo-Nazis, I don't think that's true. And we shouldn't really pretend that that's accurate. But he's taking these very real concerns that the West has really openly contributed to, whether it's, you know, arming and funding these neo-Nazi militias, whether it's this process of NATO expansion that's been happening over the last several decades, which took place, by the way, like you pointed out, Spencer, after the West totally destroyed and humiliated the Russian economy. They still continued this process of NATO expansion. You have a number of people, from Joe Biden himself to Henry Kissinger, all these kind of American politicians and diplomats openly talking about it. Tom Friedman
saw this, right? Like, Tom Friedman actually got this right. Like, Tom Friedman in the 1990s, would write, like, NATO expansion is a bad idea. Like, when the Clinton administration began pursuing it. And also, it is important to recognize that, like, you know, Poland and Romania, for instance, like, have very real historical reasons for wanting, like, outside protection against even a very weak Russia, right? Like, those are real historical, like, those are historically based. Like, the narrative that I'm about to describe, and very importantly for those out there, not endorse, but in fact describe as best I can, never, of course, is going to be interested in taking, like, those historical realities into account. So I say that as a caveat. But basically, like, in 2007, I barely remember this because I was writing about, like, Iraq primarily then. But I was covering the Pentagon as well. And I, like, barely out of the corner of my brain, like, remembered in 2007, like, Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, flying home from, like, this big international security conference known as the Munich Security Conference in a huff in protest over a speech that Vladimir Putin gave. And the speech itself is worth reading because Putin outlines in it what he is trying to say it has been like to see the fruits of American unipolarity. And with the speech, it is unfortunate that now it is so easy to cast an understanding of that perspective. That is not, again, to say an endorsement of it, but an understanding of that perspective as essentially buying Russian propaganda. The trouble for this is that, like, NATO, from the perspective of someone, as we've been describing, who has this sense of humiliation, seeing their country go from being a great power to being an abject one, in which foreign powers are able, after like making promises against NATO expansion in 1991, like violate them from their perspective, and do this while Western like shock doctrine capitalism contributes to like this overwhelming wave of destabilization in 1998. Interesting point of fact that I learned from Stephen Lee Myers. Putin kept the guy who was heavily identified with that in his government. So the narrative that Putin is somehow an alternative to this is, as best as I can tell, at a minimum, like overstated and probably like significantly bullshit. But I'm only a third of the way into this book. And from there, Putin continues to talk about how, like, you know, you talked a lot about international law. Then the war in Yugoslavia happened, and we found that you didn't actually care about the rules that you set out concerning when the United Nations, you know, blesses military force. Instead, and this is ultimately true, NATO decided for itself, and they decided at Russia's expense. There was, during that war, a very famous moment where a movement of, I think, Russian infantry towards an objective that NATO holds in Kosovo happens. General Wesley Clark, the commander of the NATO mission in Kosovo, that is to say the NATO war in Kosovo, like orders a British subordinate general to like intercept the Russian movement and stop them from advancing. And the guy famously goes, "Sir, I'm not going to start World War III for you." And then Putin, like, kind of gets to what I suspect is the reason that Bob Gates had to get up and get out of there, is that he's kind of saying to this audience, and now everything's fucking on fire. We see what you decided to do. You decided to generate a pretext to invade Iraq. You occupied it. You fucked it all up. It's a disaster that we don't know how to mitigate. You did that. I warned you not to fucking do it. Chirac warned you not to fucking do it. Schroeder warned you not to fucking did it. You fucking did it. And the rest of you went along with it. And like he goes on in this vein. And the trouble for like the US and NATO there is that, like, they can't point to how, in fact, they have in fact been successful in the rules-based international order. Like, has been a net benefit to everyone and not just been a way that the United States and its allies, and, you know, what we mean by that as well is, like, international capital, benefit from. Like, that's the point, seemingly, of the rules-based international order. And it is from there that Putin, like, then seems to basically say, like, you know, if this is the way you're going to behave, then, like, fuck this. I'm not going to go along with it. This is basically a rule of the jungle. He makes a point of saying, like, the thing that stopped nuclear annihilation is that there was a balance of power, and there isn't anymore. You took the balance of power that we had during the Cold War with a great Russia and a great America, and you smashed it. And you made us promises about how that wouldn't be predatory for us. You broke them. And now we can all see how well your plan turned out. And I don't know how overstated this is, so I don't really want to overstate anything. But that seems to have marked, because Estonia is the next year, a real point of departure for Putin to try and basically assert himself as part of this supposed return to balance. I personally think you do not, under any circumstances, have to hand it to him. His version of the balance that should emerge is Aleppo. Like, we saw what this is. Like, it is not an alternative to imperialism. It is more imperialism. Like, there is no way to view it, I think, as anything but that, like, there has to be a way to stand against both this overwhelming act of aggression, unforgivable act of aggression, against all of the American acts of aggression ongoing right now under the umbrella framework of the war on terror, the Israeli act of aggression against Palestine, on and on, all of these things. It's depressing that like we're in such a discourse where like exceptionalism still kind of reigns, and I think that is only a way to perpetuate like the atrocities of the world by convincing yourself that you're mitigating them, as any number of conflicts that like are fought under the sheen of like a humanitarian intervention. Not that this really could be like adequately, I think, like even in propaganda, like as a matter of technical adequacy, like portrayed that way. But we'll sure see the way this develops, right? Like we have not yet begun to info war.
I kind of want to bring it back home because so much of this, everything does, right? And the reaction that I've seen in the media has been, some reports on the devastation and attacks on civilians and, the victims that the media has deemed worthy. But part of it's also like, what is this going to do for prices in the United States? What's this going to do for gas prices? And very little conversation, and not to get back into the sanctions, but very little about what this is going to do for Russians, what this is going to do for the people in Ukraine, and like outside of like being like directly impacted by this. Like only some reporters, like you've mentioned them, have taken it on, but others have just kind of focused on like turning Zelensky into a sex symbol, or doing that whole weird thing that people do whenever someone new is in the media for a while. And kind of looking at this from like a 10,000 foot view. Additionally, there's been very little recognition or conversation around the suffering that people in all of these other countries who are victims of invasions, wars of aggression, imperialism, whether the United States or other countries, and very little attention has been paid to them, to similar types of suffering or displacement, the creation of refugees as a result of these conflicts, and especially, but not limited to, Yemen. And this is a country that is, enduring the worst human rights crisis in the world. 13 million or so people are poised to starve this year. The World Food Program is already struggling, and now you have to take Ukraine and probably Russia into account. So it's like more people are going to need assistance from an already strained effort. And that doesn't really get a lot of attention. So could you speak to kind of this American-centric view of victims of this conflict and how it kind of clashes with coverage of Yemenis and folks in other countries, and this, the fretting over U.S. gas prices now as a result of this as like a big thing that we should worry about?
So I'm not qualified to talk about like the oil politics stuff. I feel like people with like economics backgrounds, like I'll leave it to them. I want to learn from them. I don't want to pretend like I can like I have anything like intelligent to say about that. But I will say I did just take a road trip for family reasons this weekend. I'm like, holy shit, gas is really expensive. And I don't know which way that cuts. It's just like a fact.
But I mean, when on the day of the invasion, though, Biden specifically asked America's altruistic, moral oil CEOs to not price gouge or not do any of that stuff. So I'm sure they're going to.
I'm sure they're going to be right on that. Like, there's a bill that it's by, among other sponsors, Liz Cheney and Alyssa Slotkin, that like is going to basically move aggressively. So like U.S. based oil companies can step into the business of supplying, Germany and, however else it works, with the loss of Nord Stream 2. So like the Ukrainian people are going to lose here, but the oil companies are definitely not, right? Like this is already like aligning in such a way that seems like a pretty obvious beneficiary of a protracted war. I saw like there was a New York Times piece today that spoke to they like quoted a psychiatrist in Ukraine that just said, like, I've been, in therapy, we've been communicating about how there are, like, negative and positive ways to express your anger at the Russians for invading. Like, an example of positive ones, will be like collecting empty bottles for the, to make Molotov cocktails. And I was just like,
Jesus Christ.
As someone who, like, has reported from Iraq and Afghanistan, like, that's something I could have written about, like, an IED factory?
Absolutely not.
Like, that's something, like...
It's interesting who has this perpetual right to defend themselves and who doesn't.
And who doesn't. This is how will Israeli military censors, react to a piece like that amongst Palestinian freedom fighters, right? That has been just, like, really conspicuous, and as journalists, it's our responsibility to, like, not just pay attention to that, but, like, aggressively call attention to that when you see, like, asshole reporters sputtering on television about how, like, they can't believe this is happening in a civilized part of the world.
Yeah.
It's not even subtle. Like, really aggressive, like, in the same way that, like, we are horrifically learning who amongst Ukrainian refugees Polish border officials will and will not let in, meaning that they're not letting African refugees in Ukraine out of the country, and they may suffer and die as part of a migration crisis exacerbated by how, and this is certainly a dynamic that Putin has played a substantial role in, not just endorsing but excusing about the politics of refugee resettlement and, like, nativism offended by that, while producing the refugees through your fucking wars. It's a phenomenon that, like, over, like, 20 years in this business is just, like, really depressing to see develop, in the sense that, we're not, I don't think, asking ourselves, each of us, and, of society, asking, like, the consequences of just how much war we experience virtually, and the relationship between that and how readily, like, the discourse goes to, like, the bloodiest fucking possible option. And I would just submit that there's some sort of relationship there, that, like, the fact that wars unfold on the same devices that you use to entertain yourselves, I think inevitably has an effect of making a war about a narrative that is personally satisfying and feels maximally heroic. And that's a real fucking dangerous thing to do when we're talking about nuclear states.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think just the reactions, I know you said you had taken some time off Twitter, but the first several days after the invasion were, like,
it was pretty bad,
jarring to see how people, like, we mentioned earlier, like, all the wild takes, but, like, some of the normie posts, even, like, there was one that got dunked on relentlessly because it was, like, deranged. It was like, yeah, this is bad, but it was a couple pictures of explosions, and someone was like, yeah, but this is bad, but just take in this aesthetic. And it's like, people are so detached from the violence and the horrors of war that they can't even comprehend. It's like it's totally sanitized, and part of that's because of how the media talks about it. Part of it's because we're so inundated with military propaganda and the myth of war that it totally sanitizes just how violent and awful armed combat and war is, that people don't even recognize, like, what they're engaging with, what they're consuming, that it's about an aesthetic, or it becomes, the heroism and the valor, and turning Zelensky into this figure despite sharing pictures from a year ago. Like, it's just, people gravitate toward the same sorts of things, and if you haven't seen it or haven't read about it or haven't experienced it, the violence is completely sanitized, and you're detached from the real world consequences of it.
I would just like to say, as someone who has reported from Iraq and Afghanistan, both embedded and unembedded, that the violence of war, when seen up close, let alone experienced, is just simply like nothing you can imagine if you haven't experienced it. And I wish I didn't know that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So please, it is very good and well that anyone who looks at this circumstance is gripped with how awful it is and, will express that and seek to. And all I ask is just a bit of reflection about the consequences of primarily viewing a war virtually, having that be a typical experience, and the ways in which you might tend to read that conflict like a narrative you seek to have be satisfying. And the relationship that will have, obviously, random people are not to, they are not a grassroots thing that a foreign policy elite is compelled to react to. I don't want to give that impression. I guess what I'm sort of stumbling to say is that politicians' most aggressive instincts will seek validation from very casually violent, almost narrative in the sense of being cinematic and kind of detached from viewing this as a war. And this isn't something I think all of us, because I certainly don't exempt myself, even though I have seen, wars up close, the effects of this heavy mediation, which really masquerades itself in a social media age as not being mediation because it's not the traditional mediation of large newspapers and shit, is nevertheless something that I think has a very distorting effect in a way that is exceptionally easy to weaponize for an escalation that humanity can really afford fucking least right now.
Yeah, and it touches on something that you were mentioning before, and this is, I think, one of the most alarming things about the discourse that has been happening around here, both in the media and from our political leaders, which is that really the only solutions that we're actually hearing from people that have platforms are just, how do we continue to escalate this? How do we escalate this into a bloody, protracted, sectarian insurgency?
I guess
no one is suggesting how do we de-escalate? How do we engage in diplomacy? How do we encourage dialogue? How do we stop this from happening and stop it from getting worse? It seems like the only thing anyone is interested in talking about is how do we make this exponentially worse? And that's a very frightening prospect.
So I guess I would just say this as kind of a last thing. It seems like the war thus far has concealed two divergent, American, approaches / objectives here. The first one is save Ukraine. The second one is defeat Russia. At a superficial level, these things seem inextricable, right? Because Russia's the one who invaded Ukraine, who else would Ukraine be defeating? But the difference is that at a certain point, and this point has to be the intervention of diplomacy, very aggressively so, to force the escalation and find a way out of this as quickly as humanly possible, is that the imperative of inflicting a defeat on Russia that the West is really feeling right now will have as its battlefield Ukraine, and Ukraine will not be saved. Ukraine will be made to suffer. Ukraine will be the battleground of a great power competition that Putin had said was already underway and was prompting this. And now everyone's narrative becomes self-reinforcing. And the only people who directly suffer the most are Ukrainians and then Russians under sanctions. And then who knows how Putin will decide to try and break that deadlock. And that is how these things really escalate in very frightening ways, and ought to underscore the importance of how saving Ukraine may involve giving up the objective of inflicting a defeat on Russia. It may involve the objective, because this is how diplomacy works when it's actually positive sum, of allowing Putin some way to say, short of invading and devastating and occupying Ukraine, that he got something out of this so he can see a way out. I gotta tell you, reading this book that goes through the history of Vladimir Putin, it doesn't really seem like he's interested in that shit. So I am not pretending like I have a formula for that. I am articulating an imperative that will be extremely arduous, but must be pursued while simultaneously being the most difficult political position to sell, because it cuts against the impulse that is a very satisfying one emotionally right now in Western publics to defeat Russia, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It just does. I mean, there's not a whole lot makes sense right now, but I think in that framework, it's something. I think it's something that we can hold on to.
I'm trying. You guys, this is like me entirely extemporizing. I'm very grateful that you invited me on your show, even though I am not a Russia expert, a Ukraine expert, a guy who's trying to be on the discourse right now about any of this. So, like, we are, legally immune from being dunked on now. I just wanted to reinforce that again. The writing that it is always fair game, for you to want to dunk on a journalist for is at my Substack newsletter, Forever Wars.
All right, a great segue.
A great
segue
plug,
to get out there.
There we go.
To get us out.
Spencer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, you guys, for indulging me. That was very rambling. I have no idea how you're going to edit it, and I don't envy you.
Thankfully, that's not my job. That is right. Rob's. It's a Rob problem.
Yeah.
That's a Rob problem. It's a Rob-lum.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thanks again, Spencer. It was a pleasure to break this stuff down with you, and we'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. Talk to you.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to The Insurgents. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can find us on iTunes or Spotify or at Substack, theinsurgents.substack.com. You'll get the latest episodes delivered straight to your inbox, as well as our newsletter. On Twitter, we are at InsurgentsPod. Tweet at us, harass Ken in our replies, and then send us your hate mail to theinsurgentspod@gmail.com. Thank you once again for listening.